Good evening, good day, good morning, good afternoon, good night. Who knows? It depends where you are on the planet, I suppose. And I'm not David. I probably shouldn't have typed anything then, but we were not quite started and I wanted to share Pooja's excitement. It's logged in as P3 Tutor, but I'm not David, as those of you who know David will, of course, be aware. My name is Paul. I'm going to be taking you through some thoughts tonight or today, about preparing for exams. It's a 1 hour session, that is the aim. If at any point you want to ask anything at all, please type it in. I can see on both sides of me what you're typing, and I'll answer the questions straight to camera live. So please make the most of it. Really pleased we're doing this session now because I did another session on Tuesday night just explaining about ACCA, what it is, etc. And a couple of people on that evening made comments about why have they failed, what are they doing wrong, and of course it's one of the most common questions us tutors get asked. And one of the most common things I hear is from someone who has just got into the ACCA exams and they say something like, I've got 37 A-levels, 6 degrees, an MBA and a doctorate. I've never failed an exam in my life. I took my first ACCA exam and I failed. And it happens to a lot of people. Happens to a lot of people. So the aim of this presentation really is to talk to you about not how to pass exams, not how to prepare for exams, but how to prepare for your ACCA exams. Just before I kick off, I think one of the problems that a lot of students have is that they come through degrees and MBAs and all sorts of other things, and then they come onto ACCA, and those people who get lots of exemptions end up missing out some of the lower level papers where you can start to hone your skills as to what ACCA exams are about. And instead they go straight in at the higher level, and I think that causes people a lot of problems. I have said to 1 or 2 people in the past who've got lots of exemptions, it wouldn't be a bad idea for you not to take one of those exemptions up. Pick a subject you're very happy with, because then you can focus on actually passing the exam, not the subject, but passing an ACCA exam. It is all rather different. So, let me tell you about exam preparation then. A few ideas. There are, of course, a million things. I could write a 5,000-page book on this, and I've got an hour. So I'm going to give you a few bits and pieces, try not to overload you, and try to stick with what I think are the most important messages. Anyway, as I said, if at any point you have questions, please feel free. I have a presentation here which I'm going to run through, so I will shortly disappear from the screen and we will take a look at what I've got for you. So here we go. Right, let's get rid of that. Let's do that. Okay. So, as I said, my name is Paul. For those of us who've not met before, I am the director of ACCA programs for LSBF. I work in our London office. I worked for 3 years in our Singapore office, setting it up from scratch in terms of the academics. And I've visited every one of our offices now, and given that all of our offices are essentially using the same programs, the same materials, etc., I'm sort of in charge in London, UK, but I guess I have an impact all over the world. How exciting. And I'm also a tutor, which I think is very important. A lot of colleges, the person who's in charge of the programs doesn't actually get in front of people and teach. And I think that's the best way of understanding how to do it right. Okay, here we go. So, just to hopefully fill you with a bit of assurance that I know what I'm talking about. My name's Paul, I'm a qualified accountant. I have been doing this a very long time, and I won a prize. Yay! which is more than can be said for my favourite football team, who never win anything. 18 years, which is why I look like I'm about 95 years old. So if I don't know what I'm talking about by now, I should probably retire. If after tonight's presentation you want to ask me anything at all, my email address is up on the screen. Please feel free. You don't have to be a registered student with LSBF at all. Now, just before I get into the detail of tonight, one of the reasons we're doing these sessions using our online platform and doing them live is to show people who are thinking about coming to LSBF how they can enjoy our courses. Of course, you can come and sit in a classroom. We do that stuff too. But as a separate product and also as a freebie for anyone who signs up to classroom courses, our part-time, our evenings and weekends, you get live online as well. The only difference between the classes and what I'm doing tonight is that tonight it's all on a PowerPoint presentation because I've got specific information I want you to be able to see. Whereas when I'm actually teaching, I've got a pen in my hand. You will be able to see me and a blank screen, and I'll be doing a lot of writing and obviously taking you through a course. So tonight is more informational rather than educational, hence PowerPoint. But apart from that, you saw me earlier on before I put the PowerPoint screen up there. It's the same studio, same cameras, same sound, same quality. We're very proud of it. It works beautifully. And I would encourage you not just to watch tonight for the sake of the presentation, but just to ask yourself, is this something you think could help you study? Not talking videos here, I'm talking live tutor, able to answer questions as you type them in. It's just like being in a classroom, except you don't have to drive there and get the nasty underground train home afterwards, because you can do the whole thing sitting at home. This session, just like all our online sessions, is recorded. So if I bore you to sleep or you have to run off to a party or something, the good news is you can watch it again afterwards. Right, let's get going then. So, preparing for exams, and as I highlighted earlier, very much preparing for ACCA exams. I would not give the same advice to a university student, to any of my children sitting exams at school, as I would for what you are doing with ACCA. It is a rather different animal. So, how to pass? Well, that's easy advice, isn't it? Not too difficult. All you got to do is get 50 marks. If you can get more than 50 marks, hooray! But frankly, 50 is all you need. As you know, I've been teaching 18 years. It's almost 20 years since I finished my exams. And you know what? Nobody has ever asked what marks I got. Ever. I sometimes tell people, but frankly, no one cares. Just pass them. If you get 50 on every single exam, congratulations. You've clearly used your study time absolutely perfectly. Right, so it's all about getting 50 marks. So what I need to do is tell you how to get 50 marks. The key with ACCA exams is knowing what the examiner, and therefore the markers, because the markers are all briefed before they mark by the examiner, what the examiner will give marks for. Notice I have not said the key to passing it is knowing the stuff. Knowing it is part of it, but it's only one part of it, and to a certain extent you could argue the smallest part of it. It is about knowing what the examiner wants. And there are 16 ACCA papers, which means there are 16 examiners, and 16 people are going to have potentially different ideas as to what they want. I'll give you a simple example. There are some examiners who will say, if the question asks something like, apply Davidson's model to this scenario, some examiners would automatically assume that you're going to define what Davidson's model is before you apply it. And if that's what that examiner wants, there'll be marks for defining it. But other examiners will say, if I want it defined, I'll say, Part A, define or explain Davidson's model. Part B, apply it to the scenario. If it doesn't say define it, don't. So it's critical you know what your examiner is expecting you to do, because different examiners have different ways of doing things. The key, therefore, is knowing how to pass the exam. And if you came up to me before sitting one of the exams I teach, and I teach audit, corporate governance, ethics-y type of stuff. If you came up to me, say 5 minutes before walking into the exam hall and said, Paul, help, how am I going to pass? I would not tell you anything on the syllabus. None of the technical stuff. Rubbish. Not important. Knowing how to pass is not about knowing the stuff. It's about having tactics. And that is, to a great extent, what I'm going to be covering tonight. Now, obviously, if 5 minutes before the exam you don't know anything because you've done no work, then you may as well go home because you will fail. But even if you do know the stuff and you're a walking encyclopedia, you can quote the textbook with individual page numbers, that does not mean you're going to pass. In fact, if you've taken that approach, there's a pretty good chance you're guaranteed to fail. And it's not just about how to pass, it's also understanding how not to fail. And as you'll hear later on, I come across some students who do some amazingly stupid things, or don't do some things they really should do, and then can't understand why they failed an exam. So there are some, what I would hope are fairly obvious things, but some people need to be told them. Right, how to pass. As I mentioned earlier on, ACCA exams genuinely are very, very different to university. I've done both university and, of course, professional accountancy qualification. They are totally different. I learned at university very quickly that as long as I turned up to the exams and submitted the essays and the assignments, you'd have to work pretty hard to fail. It was almost a case of if you complete the course, you will get a degree. Now, obviously, if you work harder, you'd get a better degree. But then, of course, at university, a first versus an upper second versus a lower second, that's quite important. With ACCA, it's pass or fail. And frankly, no one cares if you got 51 or 81. I've interviewed tutors over the years who are keen to teach, and I get very nervous when, thank you, Pooja, I get very nervous when a tutor starts showing me all their certificates and saying, look at me, I got these amazing marks. Some of the best tutors I've ever met failed the paper they now teach. And that's why they're so good at it, because they failed it. And when they passed it, it's because they saw the light of how to do it, and their mark basically doubled. And that's why they're such a great tutor. They know the secret of how to pass it. A lot of people who are very good at stuff don't know there's a secret, because they're just a genius. So to be honest, if you score great marks on your exams, congratulations. If you win prizes, fantastic. Enjoy the prizes, enjoy the acclaim. Will it get you a better job and a higher salary? Probably not. So let's make sure we can get 50. Let's understand the basics of passing. When I was at university, and in fact when I was at school as well, teachers would say to me, Paul, you're very good at writing essays. And I'd say, great, thank you, but what do you mean? And they just said, when you've read one of your essays, you feel like you've read something that sort of holds together. I guess that's translated into why I now teach. I can construct a logical flow, maybe. I've no idea. But the great news was that even if I wrote an essay 1 hour before the deadline, possibly a little hungover after the night before, and possibly having not done too much work, I would normally still pass it because what I produced hung together as a product. And that's why when I sat my professional accountancy exams, I got a lot closer to failing, because there are no marks on ACCA for whether you've written a good script. I don't care. What you get marks for with ACCA are whether you are producing points that are on the marking key. Now, there are normally more than 100 points that you could get. So on a 100 mark paper, there might be, let's say, 250 potentially correct answers. It's a bit like, as we'll see later on, if I said to you, name 100 countries in the world, well, the United Nations has 193, so there are 193 potentially right answers, of which you need 100. Except you don't, because the pass mark's 50. So you only need 50 out of those 193 points. Very important issue this. When you're looking at examiners' answers, do bear in mind the examiner's answer will have all 193 points in it, which means you'll read it and think, I could never have done that. You don't need to. On an ACCA exam, your job is to get 50 of the things in the marking key, and that's it. So it's a lot more about trying to work out what would be in the marking guide, what sort of things would be in there, and if you can get your aim right, you're going to hit enough of them to pass. So that is why the key to passing ACCA exams is very heavily based around understanding the requirements and what the examiner's getting at. That's half your battle won, and then it's about the level of explanation and how good you get that point down, or how well you get that point down. Right, let's have a quick look. I'm getting suddenly lots of comments. Is it very hard to write an essay? I don't want you to write an essay, so don't. What's an essay? Interesting question, Simon. I'm not even sure I know how to answer it. Things you write at university, you know what I mean. How much do I need to write? Pooja, you need to write 50 marks worth of stuff that's on the marking guide. Then you'll get 50, the end. In order to earn 1 mark, by the way, I would normally assume you need to write about, I normally say 2 to 3 lines. Now, obviously, people have different size handwriting. I would typically say 2 to 3 lines would be making a point and explaining what you're getting at, and that should get you a mark. You could score 250 out of 100, bet you would win a prize. Simon, you're a very entertaining person. Thank you for that comment. Anyway, moving swiftly onwards. Right, the marking guide is very much based on the requirements of the question. You, of course, cannot see the marking guide before you start writing the answer, if only you could. What you can see are the requirements, and you've got to look at those and ask yourself, what would the marking guide look like? What sort of things would be in there? If you divided the marking key up into 4 sections, what would those 4 sections be? And if you've done your question practice, there really is no reason why you can't do that, because the requirements tend to be very repetitive, so you should see them and go, it's that type of question, therefore I'll be writing about that type of stuff. How do you know if you have written the correct point and not rambling? Okay, I think that's 2 questions, isn't it? How do you know if you've written the correct point? You'll never know for sure. When I'm answering a question, do I know if I'm getting it right? Yes. Why is that? I'm a genius? No. I've simply done so many questions, and very repetitive questions from our examiners, that when I see what the examiner's asking, I don't need to read the story, I already know what the correct points are going to be. So practice, it builds your confidence, yes? How do you know if you are rambling? Let me take you back to an answer I gave a minute or 2 ago. You need to write about 2 to 3 lines to get a mark. My advice is write 2 to 3 lines and make your point, and then find another point and write 2 to 3 lines on that. What a lot of students do, which does make or cause a problem, is because they're nervous, sometimes because they've not done enough work in advance, sometimes just because they're nervous types of people, they'll write what they want to write. And then because they're not convinced they've done it well enough, they'll spend another 3 or 4 lines saying essentially the same thing again with slightly different words. The main advice I can give on that is practice enough, and there's more coming up in the presentation about this very point, practice enough that you know you've explained it and can move on. I have a huge benefit when I teach in classrooms. I explain what I want to explain, and I can look into the eyes of students and I know if they've got it. Teaching in the studio is a little harder because I can't see into your eyes and I don't know if you've got it or not. What I have to rely on is my experience of having explained this sort of stuff so many times that I get to a point where I think, right, I've explained that enough and I will move on. So a lot of it is practice. And to avoid rambling, I'm now going to move on. Right, so as I said, the marking guide is based on the requirements of the question. So the requirements are key. Requirements, of course, will depend on what exam you're sitting. And if I was going to break it down into basic components, there tend to be three things you have to do to pass questions. There is knowledge. Sometimes you'll get marks for just repeating a fact. You know, what is the capital of England? London. And if you know it, you know it. There's no genius marks for writing London in a very pretty colour. It's London or it's not London, 1 mark or no mark. Simple as that. Explaining your understanding of knowledge is rather higher level, and applying that knowledge to a practical situation is, of course, higher level still. And I'm going to look at all three elements of that as we go through this presentation. So let's start with pure knowledge. Well, I say it's the easy bit because, as I say to my students in class, you must make sure you know that. You might be asked to repeat it. But I can't say any more than that. The message is, know it. How do you know it, Paul? I'm not very good at remembering things. I'll come on to that in a minute. Some people have photographic memories. Lucky them. Most of us don't. And in order to get stuff in here, we need to have a few techniques and put in the effort. Techniques are great, but there's not many shortcuts with knowledge, I'm afraid. So, some techniques. Those of you who know me, and some of my colleagues who will know me, will know that one of my favourite sayings in class to students is "Повторение мать учения." And if you are Russian or speak any Russian, you will know that that saying means repetition is the mother of learning. Repeat, repeat, repeat. It has a lot of applications in the world. When we train tutors, we often tell tutors that the best structure of a class is to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you've told them, which, when you think about it, is repetition, isn't it? It sort of works. It's quite basic, but it does work if you put the effort in. I don't speak Russian, and yet I know how to spell and say "Повторение мать учения." How is that the case? It is the case because I've said it so many times, it's become burned onto my brain. It's not the only thing though. Repetition is one, and I'm going to say more about that in a minute. Repetition. There are some other things you can do. And I'm going to show you an example of what I mean by this in a minute. Use a variety of approaches to learn stuff. Do not just sit there staring at the page, hoping it will go in through your eyes. No, it won't, unless you're that photographic memory person. So try and use a bit of variety. It makes your learning more fun, or at least less horrible. Variety, very important. In the exam, you don't get any marks for remembering something in your head. You've got to put it on paper. So prove to yourself when you're revising and learning that you know something by shutting the books, taking out a blank sheet of paper and saying, right, the 5 rules of blah, blah, blah are, and then write them down, or at the very least, say it to prove to yourself you know it. Don't just say, oh yeah, I know what those are, and move on. Write it down. Much better idea. If you've got other friends who are also sitting the exams, set each other challenges. When you next see them, say, go on then, you tell me what the 5 rules, or at least tell me 3 of the 5 rules. And get them to set you challenges too. If you don't have any friends, bad luck. If you're studying on your own, set yourself targets. And in terms of knowledge, knowledge is a lot easier to know and to store in there if you have a storage system. Now, I said earlier on So plan to write. Plan to write. I'm not sure I understand the question, so I might do, and I'll try and answer it in a minute. But if you can add to that question, it might aid my understanding. I said earlier on that there are 193 countries in the United Nations. If I was explaining this, I wouldn't start by saying, do you know what? There are 193 countries in the United Nations. For example, Finland, the Seychelles, because that's just giving examples. Surely I would start much bigger picture and say, we live on planet Earth. Planet Earth has various land masses and lots of water. The land masses over the years have separated themselves down into individual countries which have governments who run them, and there's 193 of them recognised by the United Nations. But I wouldn't start listing them. I'd drill down to the next level. I'd say there are the countries of North America, Central America, South America. Then you've got Europe. Then you've got Africa and Asia and the Middle East and the Far East and Australasia, Pacific type stuff. And only then would I say, you know, Europe, for example, Western Europe, France, Britain, Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, etc. So try to learn things by thinking big picture first and then gradually going down into different levels of detail. But don't go down to the next level of detail until you're comfortable at the previous level. It's a bit like the foundations for a building. If the lowest foundation doesn't work, a building on top of it means everything collapses. So go through it stage by stage. Okay, I heard that you don't have friends, that you become an auditor. Thank you, Simon. That, of course, is why on a Thursday evening I'm standing here doing this and all my friends are out having a party. It is the life of the auditor. It's a bad job, but someone's got to do it. I'm starting not to like Simon very much. Okay, let's have a little example. So I said earlier on there are 193 United Nations members. Go on then, name them. Don't, please, we'll be here all night. I can name all 193. I can do it in alphabetical order forwards, backwards. I can go around the world, continent by continent, whatever you like. The question is, how did I get that knowledge in there? Before I answer that, why do I know the 193 countries? Well, I'm an auditor and therefore, of course, as Simon has pointed out, have no friends and need to fill my time doing something. No, I'm a parent and two of my kids, my boys, are very keen on the world and flags and they expect me to know the entire world. And once I realised this, I made a point of learning it. How did I do it? Well, I use a bit of variety. One way to think about all the countries in the world, and the way I prefer, because I like to travel a bit and know my way around, is I like to picture the world map because I can picture countries next to each other. I think of countries in groups. So for example, if we think North America, I think Canada, USA, Mexico. I have to remember the little one called Belize. And then I remember that Central America has got 6 countries. Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Panama. On that thin bit, before you get down to South America, where I happen to know there are 10 main countries and a couple of other small ones on the edge. Why do I know there are 10 countries in South America? Because in World Cup football qualifying, their league has got 10 teams in it. You see, there's different ways of knowing it. Another way is to think about the countries you visited. And that works nicely because you can then think, what was the country next door that you wished you'd been to, or maybe you accidentally went through because the bus got lost, and that gets you a few bonus countries as well. As I just said, football, we've just had the World Cup, 32 countries. Even if you're not the world's biggest football fan, you might have caught that it was on TV, you might have heard who England lost to, or couldn't beat. You might have heard that Brazil had a bit of a... Oh, there's Brazil, there's one. Had a bit of a disaster, getting beaten 7-1 by Germany. Germany, there's another country. So, you know, there's ways you can do this, aren't there? Another way you can do it is every country begins with one of the 26 letters of the alphabet. Don't go for W or X, by the way, because there's none of those. And you could just rattle through the alphabet. And when you get to the end, you could go back and try and come up with different countries for A, B, C, D, etc., etc. Point is, there are lots of different ways of doing this. And the way I've done it is largely by taking different approaches until I had them all remembered. Famous people would, of course, be another one. You could think of famous politicians, leaders of the United Nations, Secretary Generals, famous footballers, famous actors, actresses, etc. And it's not very nice, but wars. I mean, think which countries get mentioned on television at the moment. Syria, Ukraine, Russia, of course. And it's not just wars. Think what else is going on in the news. Again, Ebola is not a very nice subject to talk about, but it tells you a few African countries that otherwise you might not hear in the news that often. So there's all sorts of ways of trying to cherry pick your answers. And please remember, 193 countries, 50 to pass. So you don't need to know all of them. Thank you, Pooja. I'm sure we will talk again. Right. So, in terms of setting a target, 193, all of them, you don't need to know all of them. Could you name 100 countries? Well, I think if you use the various techniques, yeah, you probably could. And as with your studies, once you have gone and written down or said out loud the ones you know, why not then write down the list of all the ones you didn't get? Go and look up the full answer, cross out the obvious ones, because you'll remember those every single time, won't you? You're always going to write France, Germany, USA, United Kingdom. So write down the ones that you didn't know. And if you're going to memorise anything the night before the exam, memorise those. But don't forget, you don't need all of them. Way too many people in exams get very frustrated about that 1 or 2 points in the answer. They go, I'd never have got that. Who cares? Those aren't the points that help you pass. Those are the points that separate the examiner from the rest of us, the prize winner worldwide from the rest of us. Ignore them. The key to passing is to get 50 points, any of those 50 points. If there are harder points, forget about them. They're not your problem. Pure repetition. Now, I said earlier on, I know all 193 members of the United Nations. In order to make absolutely sure I was memorising them, because I wanted to make sure to my boys that I knew them, this is what I did. And I've developed this approach now for memorising other things as well. I do a lot of running on a treadmill. It's not very exciting. The treadmill is in my garage. I get to look at my garage wall. Boring. But I need to keep in shape, and unfortunately I'm unfit. So I do a lot of running. And this is what I do. I get on the treadmill and I start. And every 8 steps, I name a country. Australia, New Zealand, etc. And I keep going until I've done all 193. If I'm meeting someone and I get to the pub or the restaurant before they do, or if I'm sitting on a train and my train's broken down for a while, it's delayed, sometimes I get a sheet of paper out and I write down all 193 countries. Yeah, really, I do. Now, of course, it sounds a bit ridiculous, but if you've got exams coming up in a couple of weeks' time, why don't you do that? For the stuff you need to know, why not write down every accounting standard number and remind yourself what that standard is about? Every audit standard number. It really does work. Pure repetition. Tutors have a habit of looking like they know everything. Well, if we do, it's because we've stood up in front of so many people and said it over and over and over again that it's sort of forced it in there. Trust me, we weren't geniuses when we started. Pure repetition works, but you've got to force yourself to do it. Question is, how much good are you actually doing yourself with all this knowledge? Does it earn you marks? Well, of course, on the lower level papers, it will do, especially if there's multiple choice questions, because a lot of them are testing, do you know your stuff? But as the papers get higher, the level of marks for knowledge tends to disappear. However, it has its uses. No, Simon, countries don't come up in the exam. I was just trying to give you an example without being specific to my exam papers, something that I thought would be open to everyone who was watching this and might watch it in the future. But of course, what we really want to make sure we know are the accounting rules, the audit rules, the tax rules, blah, 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 blah. So it has uses on higher level papers. Strangely, Simon, the higher you go, the less you need to know is absolutely true. And I suspect it's not just true in exams, but true in a lot of life as well. But yeah, I realise you're only joking, sir. But the fact is, yeah, that last point you've made, the value of the knowledge disappears. And if you think about it, there's a reason for that. Because the boss in a company would expect lower level staff to know their stuff. The boss is more concerned with bigger picture stuff like winning clients and strategy. They haven't got the time to keep updating themselves on the latest this and the latest that. That's why they have staff. In terms of the exams, once you've proven your knowledge at the lower levels, it moves on more to showing your understanding and applying it, which we're coming on to. But how can it be useful on a higher level paper? Well, I'm an auditor, so here's an audit question. Describe the audit risks in the above scenario. Now, if you're doing this question, you've just read that requirement and there's a big 2 or 3 page scenario full of detail. It can be very demotivating. But auditors primarily care about the danger that this set of accounts, these financial statements, are wrong. And financial statements can only have certain things in them. There's a finite list of accounting issues. Auditors therefore are worried about, are the accounting rules being breached? And there's only so many rules. So one way to approach that question, before you even read the story, is to remind yourself that in your answer, the only things you're going to be talking about are IAS 1, presentation of the accounts, IAS 2, stuff to do with inventory, so maybe in the story there's something about inventory valuation for it, there's a problem with the stock. You're going to be talking about the cash flow statement perhaps, doesn't really come up much. 8, accounting policies, so maybe they're using a policy that's not allowed, maybe they've changed accounting policy during the year, have they dealt with that properly? You could be talking about IAS 10, events after the reporting period. So look at the year end and look at dates. And you see what I'm doing here? I'm giving myself a few ideas about what to look out for in the story that I might otherwise miss. Because every audit risk question can only cover those IASs from 1 through to 41. And of course, there's a lot of gaps in the numbers. There aren't 41 to know, so relax. And IFRS is 1 through to 15. So if you know what all of those are and can think for 5 seconds, oh yeah, well, IAS 16, property, plant, equipment, key issues, revaluation, depreciation methods, blah, 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 blah. If you can get that good at the knowledge, you've got a nice little checklist to use against the story. So the knowledge has a lot of benefit, even on the higher level papers. Right, I've talked about knowledge and 1 or 2 ideas about that, but as I'm trying to point out here, knowledge has its uses, but there are more difficult challenges you've got to passing the exams. Knowledge will not normally get you enough marks to get through alone. So, explaining your understanding. A tutor's tale. I'm not sure this is a tutor's tale, but when I first started teaching 500 years ago, I walked into class thinking, I've passed my exams, these guys are only students, this won't be a problem. And then I started explaining things and people started asking me questions and I thought, that's a good question. I hadn't thought of that. Being able to explain something is very different from knowing it. London is the capital city of England. Congratulations. What does that actually mean? If an 8-year-old came up to you and said, what do you mean by capital city? What would you say to them? It's the biggest? Well, London's the biggest city in England, but a lot of capital cities aren't the biggest. What does capital mean? It's where the government's based? Even that's not true in some countries. Now, I'm not going to explain what capital cities are because that's not important, of course. My point is, do you actually know? Have you ever thought about it? And what I would say to you is when you're learning stuff for exams, don't just go, I now know this fact. Ask yourself why. Why is that a fact? Why do debits go on the left and why do credits go on the right? Now that won't help you pass because understanding that's not actually that important. But 99% of the stuff you are meant to know is a lot easier to memorise and a lot easier for you to explain if you've actually thought about why. So, don't just learn stuff. Practice explaining it. Explain it to yourself. Stand in front of a mirror. Explain it to your fellow students. Send emails to your tutors and say, I'm not sure I've fully got this. Here is my understanding. Is this right? And get the tutor to give comments on it. That would make a lot of sense. Practice explaining it yourself so that on exam day, your explanations flow nicely. I was at an event at the end of last year where some, not sure I'd say senior people, but some reasonably senior people from various colleges sat round a table and we constructed a magazine article with a magazine called PQ Accountant. And one of the questions that was put to the people around the table was, if you could give one piece of advice to students, what would it be? And two of us, one of whom was me, said exactly the same thing. We both said, make sure the word that appears the most on your exam paper is the word because. Because if you put the word because or in order to, or something else of that type, in every sentence you write, it shows that you've not just learned stuff, the marker will be seeing that you understand why. And if you do that and get into that habit, especially on the higher level papers, your marks will go through the roof. They really will. Sometimes, of course, it might not actually get you any benefit, but most of the time it will. And it gives the impression to the marker as they're allocating marks that you are trying to talk at a deeper level. You're analysing in more detail. It's one of the most common criticisms that the examiners have. Students just didn't write in enough detail. They could come up with the ideas, but there wasn't enough analysis to answer the question. The other thing it will do, a lot of people just don't write enough words. This will double the length of what you write. London is the capital city of England because it's based in the southeast of the country, nearest the other countries who are just across the English Channel. It's got a big river which outlet goes into the North Sea, which is in the direction of those other countries, which means when there was shipping, you see how long this has become, because I'm now explaining. So my advice would be explain everything you write, because 9 times out of 10, you're doing yourself a favour. Very good habit to get into. I think most tutors would say the same thing on this. If there is a paper with numbers on it, you know, tax calculations, consolidations of group accounts, very few students will turn up on exam day having not practiced that. Numbers we like to practice. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One of them is the fact that you can check if you've got it right, because a number is a fact. If you got the right number, you got it right. What students are not very good at is practicing the words. They'll look at a question, they'll think what the answer is, look at the right answer and go, yeah, I'd have written something like that. Which means on exam day, they've never written it themselves. And now for the first time under exam time pressure, you've got to explain yourself. Yeah, good luck with that. When people are up in court, they're going to get asked some very nasty questions and they need to get the answers right and explained clearly. So before they go to court, of course, their lawyers help predict the sort of things they're going to be asked, and they say, right, if I asked you that, what would you say? Because that way, when they explain it in court, it's not the first time they've had to say it. They've thought about what they want to say and how they want to say it, and they've practiced doing it. I suggest for your exams, you need to practice it yourself. If you read examiners' reports, more on this coming up shortly, the exam reports are very clear. There are some bits of questions, knowledge, calculations, where students do fairly well. The moment you get to anything practical, like that describe the audit risks question earlier on, the marks fall through the floor. They are appallingly low. Everyone can get the knowledge if they want. The key is don't just get the knowledge, you've got to practice the written stuff. It's not a lot of fun, it takes longer, and when you compare your answer with the examiners, you're bound to have written something slightly different because there are 98 ways of explaining things. It's not like the numbers. But you've still got to practice, and if you're not sure if your answer is good enough, type it up, send it to a tutor or by email and say, look, is this a decent explanation or not? Would I get a mark for this? You've got to use your tutors. That's why we're here. That's what you're paying for. So, I've looked at knowledge and how you might get that. I've spent a bit of time talking about how to explain your understanding and how to practice doing that and how important it is. Now applying knowledge to a scenario. The third bit, and the most difficult. And this, I think, is very much where we have our biggest value. I can tell you, learn the knowledge. I can tell you, this is what it means. Now you practice writing that in your own words. I can show you how to apply knowledge, but application requires practice, and you have got to do it yourself. If I was teaching you how to learn to swim, I can't do the swimming for you. At some point, you've got to hurl yourself into the water and have a go. Unfortunately, a lot of students turn up to their accounting exams having never got wet, which I find extraordinarily stupid, but a lot of people will do it. And in terms of answering the questions, there are good students who seem to have a natural affinity. I mentioned swimming and, riding bikes, another good example. Some people can just do it. Some people get into a car and can drive the car with virtually no tuition. They've just got the knack. Most people can't. And that is where your tutor becomes so important, showing you how this examiner wants you to apply and how they want you to produce your answer. I said earlier that last year I was at an event and was asked, what's the most important piece of advice? After it, I thought actually there's something else I might have said instead. And the more I think about it, the more I think it is more important. Zafar, who's appeared and is in blue. Hi. Is it compulsory to attempt whole paper at P level to pass it? Well, the P papers have got optional questions on, so don't attempt everything, just do enough optional questions. It's not compulsory, but I mean, if you take P1 as an example, a 50 marker, and then you've got to do two 25s, if you leave out an entire 25 mark question, getting 50 out of 75, that's 67%. That's pretty good and pretty difficult. My advice would be try to attempt every part of every question. If you genuinely have no clue what it's asking, and it's only worth 3 or 4 marks, maybe write a couple of sentences and cross your fingers and don't worry about it. But anything worth 5, 6 marks or above, I think you've got to have a go at it. My last presentation, which was on Tuesday, was recorded. I don't know yet if it's on the website, but it will be. If you have problems finding it, please email me. I'll talk to my support guys out there and I will find it for you, okay? Right, as I was saying, very important this. I think this might actually be more important. Let me explain. And for Simon's sake, I know 10-pin bowling is not coming up on the exam. Just let me use it, okay? Because I think it proves the point. No problems so far. Right. I say brilliant, that's a slight exaggeration. But I am pretty good at 10-pin bowling. I've just been on holiday with my family. We did a bit of 10-pin bowling. My kids hate me because I'm not bad. I'm pretty good. Not world champion, but and the last time we went out for work and we went 10-pin bowling earlier this year, I won. And I won by some distance. And what's weird is I don't have the decent physique for a 10-pin bowler. I don't have a strong upper body. I'm more of a runner, so I'm more stronger lower body. And of course, 10-pin bowling balls are quite heavy and you need power and la 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 la. And I don't have that upper body power. If you watch me bowl, the ball goes rather more slowly than some of my friends who power it down there like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I also don't play that often. I don't get the chance to play that often. Remember, I'm an auditor. I've got no friends. How sad would I look going 10-pin bowling on my own? So I don't play that often, maybe a couple of times a year. So how am I so good at it then? Because it's not the practice, is it? Because I don't practice that much. So what is it? Well, I'll tell you. Why am I good? Because whenever I bowl in 10-pin bowling, whether it's a little bit competitive or I'm just out having a few drinks with friends, when I pick that ball up and I'm lining up, I have the same thought going through my head as I bowl it every time. And that thought is there as I am bowling. It's a rather useful tip actually for sport in general, because there are two things in sport, a lot of sports, that seem to work very well. Head still, follow through. You want to score goals playing football, head still as you kick the ball, follow through with the leg. 10-pin bowling, it doesn't matter if you bend down, it doesn't really matter. If you want the ball to go straight, the arm goes straight afterwards. You do that and it's probably going straight. Certainly 9 times out of 10. And that's it. It's as simple as that. I don't do all the spinning stuff. I can't make the ball rotate in. And yet I can still score 160, 170 most times. And that's enough to beat most amateurs. It's all about what's going through your head. Now, if I practiced enough, I probably wouldn't have to force myself to think it. Because I don't play that often, whenever I pick the ball up, I have to say, right, what do I need to remember? Head still, follow through. And especially in the higher level exams where there's a lot of technique and thinking what the examiner wants, my advice to students is when you see what type of question it is, like the audit risk question earlier on, you have got to stop and say, right, okay, this is an audit risk question. What did my tutor tell me I need to do when doing an audit risk question to get the marks? Think about the bowling ball. And as you're writing the answer and bowling that ball, think about the technique and then you'll do it. Don't think about it outside the exam hall before you walk in and then ignore it for 3 hours. It's got to be coursing through your head throughout the exam. I think that is incredibly important. Even the world's best golfers, every so often, they hit the ball and off it goes at some bizarre angle. And you can see them thumping the club down because they know they've done that mistake. And they know they could have avoided it because maybe their mind slipped somewhere else, they forgot to think, must keep head straight, and as a result, they screwed up. Now, of course, they don't do it often because they've done the practice. So a mixture of practice and knowing what the technique is and having it going through your head while you're doing questions. Now, as I said, I have to tell myself to do that when I'm bowling. But maybe if you do enough practice, especially if you're only sitting one paper, the techniques will automatically be in there by exam day. You'll be like a machine, you'll just do it. But most students never do enough practice to get into that situation. I said earlier on, if you came up to me 5 minutes before the exam and said, Paul, help. If it was one of my papers, I'd say, right, when that question comes up, because it always does, you are going to think the following things. Write them on the question paper so that when you're answering it, you're seeing it. It's telling you what to think. If that question comes up, think that. If that question comes up, think that. No technical knowledge, all tactics, just like the 10-pin bowling. So my advice the night before the exam, don't open the book and try and learn stuff you don't know. Too late, forget it. Focus on tactics. That's what you've got to do. Right, we have a question. We're also nearing a conclusion and nearing the end of my hour. If I attempt 85 marks out of 100, will I fail because I didn't attempt the whole 100? There have been discussions about this in the past, but at present, that's not how it's marked. You are marked, as I said earlier, against a marking key. In theory, you could attempt 50 of the 100 marks, get all 50 of them, and you've passed. The fact that you haven't done something does not count against you. Realistically, though, most students, if they're attempting a 10-mark question, get the first 3 or 4 marks fairly quickly, and then it becomes more of a struggle. Therefore, the most sensible advice is make sure you at least start every part of a question, because when you start a part of a question, you're likely to pick up some quick marks. So don't spend ages trying to get that 10th point in a 10-mark question. If you got 9 points down, be happy. Move on to the next bit. Before we get to our conclusion though, earlier on I said it's about knowing how to pass and knowing how not to fail. If I start teaching after passing ACCA without getting practical experience, then teaching experience will count towards ACCA membership, please. 2 things. Number 1, most colleges won't let you teach if you're not a full member of the ACCA. So if you haven't got the experience, you're not a full member, you can't teach. Would be one thing I'd say. Secondly, if you look at the practical experience requirement, the PER for ACCA, there's not a lot of stuff in there that teaching's going to count for, to be honest. So it might count for something, but it's not going to count for much. So I wouldn't look at it like that, I'm afraid. I don't really want to cover PER because that's not exam preparation, which is what tonight's about. If you're not sure about that, email me. Okay, right, how not to fail. I hear this a lot, and it makes me groan every time. True story from the sitting we've just had. In fact, this happened this week. I got a call this week from a student who wanted some advice. 1 paper left, P5. They failed it 4 times in a row. It happens. Bad luck. Worryingly, their marks are getting worse. So they asked me for some advice. And specifically, they said, Paul, do you think I should ditch P5 and do one of the other option papers instead? So we had a talk about the fact that, you know, done it 4 times, shame to waste all the knowledge that's no doubt there. It's probably your technique that's wrong, etc., etc. And I then asked a question, and I almost knew what the answer was going to be. I said, of course, one way to know if you're doing this right and if there's something fundamentally wrong is to read the examiner's report. After every sitting, the examiner writes a report after speaking to the markers about what went well and what went badly and why. So I said, you know, the examiner's report's up there on the web, and obviously you've done this 4 times. What did you think after reading it? And I sort of knew the answer I was going to get. Worryingly, they'd never read one. Turns out, not just for P5, for all the other papers that they'd passed, they'd never read an examiner's report. I find this very strange. You're sitting an exam, and the person who sets the exam, and the person who instructs the markers how to mark the exam, the person who writes the marking guide, is telling you what people get wrong, and why they're getting it wrong, and why they're not passing, on a question-by-question basis. And trust me, those examiner reports say pretty much the same thing every 6 months, and you've not read them, you must be stupid. Seriously, this is bizarre. There are so many resources out there. The ACCA website has got lots of stuff on each paper, a lot of it from the examiner themselves. Read it. Ask your tutors about anything that's in there you don't understand. Of course, we've read them. I don't have to sit the exam though, do I? You do. Read them. It is craziness not to. look at the exam paper question by question, and after each question, go and read the section of the exam report about that question. And if the examiner's saying stuff and you're thinking, I'd never have gone down that route, then clearly for that style of question, you're underprepared. Even weird examiners, and there are some, tend to be very repetitive, very predictable, and if you say, oh, I'd never have thought that question was coming up, then you've not done your preparation. So to not read what a predictable person is telling you about how to deal with their very predictable questions is just crazy behaviour. So come on, put a bit of effort in. So read the examiner's report as part of your study. Especially useful in the last couple of weeks before the exam to focus your technique and to know where the traps are. Okay, well, time is running out. Maybe there are some more questions. If there are, please type them in now. Here's my conclusion. I cannot make my students do the knowledge. I can encourage them. I can try and make the subject sound interesting enough they might go and study it. At the end of the day, it's down to you. Your tutors, your textbooks will tell you what you need to know. Know as much of it as you can. You don't need to know it all. The understanding bit requires you to think about and question, yeah, but why is that done like that? Why do we have provisions, but we also have something called contingent liabilities? What's the difference between them and why? Pretend you're the tutor. If you had to explain it to someone, what would you say? Because if you understand it, you'll be a lot better at doing the questions and a lot better at explaining yourself. And as I said before, use the word because in your answers as much as you can. Application, the hardest bit. Of course, if you've got the knowledge and the understanding, you might already have enough to pass. But on the higher level P papers, there is a reason why the pass rates are so low. Most of the marks, 80, 90% of them, are not for what you know. They are for your ability to analyse a situation and create an answer. Thankfully, fairly predictable situations that have come up time and time again. So that is where your tutor, who has seen all the past papers, read all the examiner reports, knows what students get wrong, that is where we earn our money. And that is why you want to go on courses, especially revision courses, because that's where the application to the questions tends to be done the most. Right. One final point, sorry, as I was referring to earlier with the 10-pin bowling, the golf. Think about what you are trying to do as you are doing it. So you must practice application questions, you must practice explaining yourself, and you must train yourself to think the right thoughts while you're doing it. Technique, technique, technique. Have it in your head whilst you're doing the exam. I would love to be in the exam hall and walk around saying, guys, in question 1, don't forget it's I don't know, an audit report question. Therefore, you should be thinking the following sort of things when writing your answer. But I can't be there. I'm not allowed. It's against the rules. Up to you to do it yourself. So, no problems so far. I will try to have a nice weekend. Thank you all for listening patiently. I think I've timed that just about right. Just about. Does anyone else have any other questions? And Nikki, I'm glad it was informative. Just to repeat, while I'm waiting to see if there are any other questions, please, 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 if you think of something afterwards, my email address was back at the beginning of the presentation, pmerison@lsbf.org.uk. Please feel free to email me and ask. Okay, well, there you go. Hang's got some questions. Can I email you? Absolutely. So yeah, when you see the copy of the recording, once it's up, if you weren't there at the beginning, you'll see my email address. If I was clever, I could go back through this like this, but it's probably quite a long way back through. Yes, 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 it is. And maybe I could put the email address back up here. Oh, it's miles back, isn't it? I'll keep clicking. Hopefully I'll get there soon. If I don't, oh, here we go. We're getting close. I would like to say thank you again to everybody. There you go. One email address. And yeah, if it's technique, then you need to talk to a tutor and get the tutor to tell you what the technique is and then have it in your head and practice it. Simple as that. But it does need you to talk to a tutor on that paper, because technique is paper specific to a very great extent. So, thank you all very much. Let's just get that back up and I'll come back again. Hello. It's been very entertaining for me. I hope it has been to you as well. Please feel free to send me questions if you wish. And the very best of luck with your studies. I hope they will be with LSBF, and I hope at some point I will see you in class. Thank you. Bye-bye.